any of the people that are speaking the prophets using repetitiously shows us the importance of that. So here in John 15, the word abide is one that is used repeatedly. Okay? So let us look at this. John 15, I'll begin in verse 1. Jesus says, I am the true vine, and my Father is the vine dresser. Every branch in me that does not bear fruit, he takes away. And every branch that bears fruit, he prunes it so that it may bear more fruit. You are already clean because of the word which I have spoken to you. Abide in me, and I in you, as the branch cannot bear fruit of itself unless it abides in the vine. So neither can you unless you abide in me. I am the vine, you are the branches. He who abides in me and I in him, he bears much fruit. For apart from me, you can do nothing. If anyone does not abide in me, he is thrown away as a branch and dries up, and they gather them and cast them into the fire, and they are burned up. If you abide in me, and my words abide in you, ask whatever you wish, and it will be done for you. My Father is glorified by this, that you bear much fruit, and so prove to be my disciples. Just as the Father has loved me, I also loved you. Abide in my love. If you keep my commandments, you will abide in my love, just as I have kept my Father's commandments and abide in his love. These things I have spoken to you so that my joy may be in you and that your joy may be made full. Okay, so abide, and the word abide, we get this idea of like, a dwelling, like living, right? You make your abode in, you live in it. Literally, it holds an understanding of remain or stay. That would be a definition of it. Remain or stay. So Jesus is saying, essentially, remain in me. Stay in me. Live in me. And again, over and over and over again, he's stressing this concept. Let's begin by first asking, why? Why is Jesus saying, again, think about what's about to happen, right? He's about to go to the cross. He's going to be crucified. Eventually, he's going to be resurrected, and then he's going to ascend. Just the chapter prior, he told us he was going to be leaving and going to the Father, right? But he wasn't going to leave them alone. But indeed, he was going to be leaving, okay? So now here he is saying, remain in me, abide in me, live in me. Why? What do we notice in here? What did he say? What's something that first touches your eye as to why does he want his disciples to remain in him? Rick? Yeah, very good. Rick's lesson last week came from John chapter 14 and verse 6. I am the way, the truth, and the life. And in fact, right, the reason Jesus said that was because he told them, don't let your hearts be troubled, right? If you believe in me, if you believe in the Father, if you believe in God, believe in me also. He says, in my Father's house are many dwelling places, and I go to prepare a place for you. And if I'm going, it's okay because you can be there also. It's okay. You don't have to worry. And then Thomas, John 14, verse 5, says to him, Lord, we do not know where you are going. How do we know the way? And Jesus says, I am the way, the truth, and the life. So, yeah, if we want to follow and end up where Jesus is, we have to remain in him because he is the way. So very good. What's another reason perhaps we notice here? How about the very first sentence there in chapter 15? I am the true vine. Okay, that connects with, right, him being the truth. But what's maybe elaborate a little bit more with regard to the true vine? What are your thoughts on that? Okay, connected to bear fruit, Cam says. Yeah, 100%, right? And then going back to, Stephen talked about, the Ten Commandments and having a meal with Moses. Well, the Old Covenant, right, that Mosaic covenant was established, by Moses and God. And Israel throughout the Old Testament, there is this terminology of them being, the vine of God and so on and so forth. Well, again, the Pharisees, they thought that just because they were Jews, that they were that. Well, Jesus is here saying, I am the true vine. So if you want to bear fruit, right, then you have to belong to the vine. And, every branch that is not connected to me is not going to bear fruit. Les? Okay. So what else? Okay. Yeah, very good, Vicki. Okay, so verses 7 and 8, that is really a result, right? So if we want to glorify God, and we can think about what Jesus said on the Sermon on the Mount, right, as being the salt of the earth and the light of the world, and thus we glorify our Father who is in heaven. If we want to glorify Him, Jesus says here, the way we prove that is by bearing fruit and abiding in Him. So by remaining in Him and bearing fruit, we are thus glorifying our Father and proving to be His disciples. So you could actually even flip that to the opposite as well, right? Which suggests that if we're not bearing fruit and if we're not remaining in Him, then are we glorifying our Father? So, very good. And, okay, another reason, right, getting back to the bearing of fruit, that if we're not bearing fruit, what does Jesus say is going to happen? Yeah, right? God's going to do away with us. And, so any branch that doesn't bear fruit is thrown away. It's taken away. But I also love that every branch that does bear fruit, what does Jesus say God's doing with it? Pruning it. Pruning it to produce more fruit, right? If you ever do gardening, you have to be constantly pruning and getting it down to its best components to be able to bear more fruit. So something that just bears fruit, it's not going to do one and done, so to speak. And unless it's an annual, but right, in God's eyes, we're not annuals, we're perennials. So what's another one? Yeah.
Some of the things that tempted us before probably will not. So the longer we're there, the more fruit we get, the better off we are.
Very good. Yeah, so Les was just touching on, our pruning means, getting rid of the bad habits and trying to produce more of the good, right? So no question, like Peter, 2 Peter 3, growing in the grace and knowledge of our Lord Jesus Christ. And in chapter 1 of 2 Peter, those Christian virtues that we call them, those are the areas that we grow in. And Peter says that if those values and virtues, if we have those, and if they are increasing, they render us neither useless, or unfruitful for the service of God. So, absolutely. Anything else that you notice in here as to why we must remain in Him? Yeah. Yeah, real joy, verse 11 there, right? Jesus' joy, and that our joy may be made full, right? It's really understanding our true purpose in life is to glorify God. But let's focus a bit more on going back to what Rick touched on, which is that Jesus is the way, the truth, and the life, right? And so remaining in Him. And again, there was going to be a lot of turmoil that was going to be coming, right, with Jesus going to the cross and persecution that was going to come upon, the disciples and the apostles. So let's just look at just this kind of immediate context and these maybe even just these disciples Jesus is talking to here, and perhaps some roadblocks, if you will, some stumbling blocks that maybe were hindrances to them remaining in Jesus. So again, think about Peter, think about Judas, think about Thomas. And what do we notice here kind of in this sort of context that we're finding ourselves here? How about Judas? Let's start with Judas. That's an obvious one, right? He did not remain in Jesus. Why not? What was his main roadblock, if you will? Greed. Yeah. You go back to the lesson that Josh did from chapter 12, right before this Last Supper that we have here, with the perfume, right, that we find, and Judas was saying, why don't we keep this and give it to the poor? But we're told that he didn't really want to give it to the poor. He's the one that had the money box, and we know that he betrayed Jesus for 30 pieces of silver. And back in chapter 13, we find chapter 13, verse 2, that during supper, the devil, having already put into the heart of Judas Iscariot, the son of Simon, to betray him. So Satan didn't cause. And it's easy to read that and see, well, Satan caused Judas. He didn't have any choice. But we all have a choice, right? Satan works using our weaknesses. And so he knew Judas's weakness, and he allowed Satan to enter into him, and he gave in to his greed. 30 pieces of silver. Now we know later he gave that back. He felt guilty. Was there a hand, Rick? Did you have a hand up? Yeah, good thought. And again, there's discussion. We recently talked about this, previous class. I think they were most likely baptized under John's baptism at this point, and which raises a different question, and we can get into it maybe at another class going forward too. But yeah, so good question. And so with us too, right? We can be baptized, we can obey the gospel, but we still have to continue and remain and abide because we haven't reached our destination. Just like, the recent Wednesday night, talk, and the class or the Tuesday devotional that Cam did, right? We haven't reached that goal yet, right? We're forgetting what lies behind, but we're pressing forward to attain that goal that is ahead of us. We haven't reached it yet. Now, yes, we're saved, and nothing can take that from us except ourselves. And if we choose not to remain and abide in him. Another hand? Brian?
Something that I had to go through. I still go through different areas, but it was hard for me to learn to take that chalkboard in my mind and erase everything off of it that I learned and taught, legacies, traditions, things that are handed down from friends, family, and replace it with the new covenant, the new, the right way to do things. Because just because someone's done it for a while doesn't mean it's right.
Absolutely. Yeah. No, very good. And I like the word you chose there of replacing it because, we do need to fill, right? Fill that void. And, and that's exactly really what Paul talks about there in Philippians is he's talking in that context of all the things that he had under his former life of being, a Pharisee and a prominent person in the Jewish faith. And he gained a lot of things and had a lot of prominence, but he had to, all those things now really meant nothing, right? But what he gained in Christ was so much more. And he had to learn that as well. So Okay, so we think about Judas, right? How about Peter? Okay, Tracy mentioned having supper with Peter. Peter, we find, right, in chapter 13, the end of chapter 13. Again, this is this same meal. Jesus told him he was going to be leaving. Verse 36, chapter 13, Simon Peter said to him, "Lord, where are you going?" Jesus answered, "Where I go, you cannot follow me now, but you will follow later." Peter said to him, "Lord, why can I not follow you right now? I will lay down my life for you." And Jesus answered, "Will you lay down your life for me? Truly, truly, I say to you, a rooster will not crow until you deny me 3 times." And it was just a handful of hours later that Peter denied the very Lord that he said he would lay down his life for. So, what was Peter's roadblock? What kept him, right, from remaining faithful? Fear. Yeah, fear. How real is fear in our lives? Very real. Yeah, in a lot of ways, right? We fear death. Yeah. That's right. Sure. Yeah. No, in fact, we find once Jesus is arrested and he's questioned, right? Something that struck me for a while is he says, "Don't ask me, ask my disciples." Really implying, but they're not there, and why not? Why aren't they there? And so. Yeah, and fear, and Jesus is absolutely, preparing them. And there's a reason why over and over he says, don't fear he who can destroy the body, but fear him who can destroy the soul. And, so we can fear death, we can fear persecution, we can fear losing our jobs. And even go back to, Wolfgang's lesson from John chapter 9, where that man was born blind and he was healed by Jesus. His parents, no doubt, knew that this was an undeniable miracle, and yet they refused to answer because they were afraid that they would be cast out of the synagogues. So, our social, circles, we can be afraid of being cast out of those because of our faith and our commitment to the Lord. So, a lot of, and there's it's no secret why, totalitarians and governments and use fear perhaps as their greatest tool to control people. It's always been that way. Fear can really prevent us from following the Lord. Les?
Their fear was, first place was the unknown, because they were where we're going.
Yeah.
And yet we throw rocks at them, because sitting here, we throw
Sure.
rocks at them. They were with the master and blah, blah, blah. And yet here we are with an old perspective they didn't have. To look back on all of history, everything else, and they're having the same conversation that they had. So when we talk about the Lord being long-suffering,
Yeah.
we're having the same conversation.
Yeah, and you could even, and I like that you point that, so look forward to today, 2,000 years, but even go backwards. It was the same story with the Israelites over and over and over again, right? People are people, and we have the same weaknesses, and we always have, and we always will. And it's the same struggles. So we can look at that, and how about Thomas, right? Thomas, his doubt, yeah, his doubt. And so here in John 14, he didn't know where Jesus was going, and so we can think about doubt, we can think about really failure to understand what Jesus is saying. Of course, later after the resurrection, Thomas said, "I won't believe unless I personally see him." And I think that's given to us today because Jesus isn't here personally with us, showing us, his hands and his feet. But we can still believe, and we have to believe and remain in him if we're going to follow that. Callie? That's right. And good point. Very good point. Yeah, that we shouldn't fear and doubt because God is always with us. And that was something that Jesus, during this last meal, was really stressing. I'm not leaving you alone. I'm going to leave my Spirit with you, and he will guide you, and he will be with you. So, very good. And we know the same is true for us, right? We have his Spirit indwelling us. We have his Word with us to guide us, too. So, very good. There's many others we could think about, but we each have our own roadblocks, and Satan will try to use those, and we can also succumb to just our own doubt and our own fear as well. So the next we notice is Jesus wants them to remember, okay, verses 12 through 27. Remember. So don't just remain, but also remember what I've told you and what I've showed you. Remember to love one another, verse 12. This is my commandment, that you love one another just as I have loved you. Okay, and connect that with verse 9 where he says that as the Father has loved me, I have also loved you. Abide in my love. And you go back to chapter 13 where Jesus told them, the new commandment, chapter 13, verse 34. A new commandment I give to you, that you love one another, even as I have loved you, that you also love one another. By this all men will know that you are my disciples, if you have love for one another. So there's another instance of really proving to be a disciple of Jesus, and it's through, our love of one another. And this isn't just, a feeling of love and, a sentiment towards each other. It is that deeper love of really meeting each other's needs and putting each other first, right? Of course, that's what Jesus was doing this whole time. What's an example here during this Last Supper that Jesus gave? Because I love this too, that he didn't just say it, right? He showed it. And he's going to show it ultimately by going to the cross, right? We touched on that recently, John 3:16. But during this last meal, what did he do? Yeah, he washes their feet, right? John 13, verses 5 and following. He washes their feet. That's the most humbling thing that a person could do, especially as dirty as their feet would have been. And yet here is the Lord washing their feet. And of course, Peter's going to say, whoa, don't wash my feet. I need to wash yours. But Jesus is showing them humility, showing them love, and showing them the way. Steve? Yeah, that's right. Dying for your enemies and your friends. Jesus is going to speak about that. Was there another hand? What's any other examples or thoughts with regard to this, loving one another? He wanted them to remember this, and 1 John 3 and 4 are such powerful passages about the love of Jesus and our obligation to love one another. We are obligated as his disciples to love one another because he loved us and he died for us. And if we claim to be his disciples and if we want to follow him and remain in him, then we have that obligation to do so as well. Brian? Yeah.
People get nervous when they get in large crowds to shake hands or hug someone. It's the fear, like Les was talking about. If it's,
I appreciate you bringing that up, and so the last, couple years, and so the sickness, and then the viruses, but that fear, and again, I think, there are people pumping out that fear to their own gain, but it has, in a lot of ways, especially early on, kept a lot of Christians away from one another. And if you're apart from one another, and if you're afraid to even get close, how can you love them? How can you serve them? How can you encourage them? But even on a deeper level too, expanding on that, our world is not just full of a literal illness, right? But it's a spiritual illness, and we talked about that recently. And there's this push for us to be divided and to hate one another and to be angry at one another, and we're not exempt from that, right? We can easily fall into that same mentality of, this person or that person, and, Jesus, as Steve was just saying, I think about what Matthew 5, Jesus says on the Sermon on the Mount, to love your enemies. That might be one of the hardest truths to accept, to love your enemies. So, we have to remember that, right? To love one another. Okay, we got a couple minutes left, but Jesus also wanted them to remember, and this is kind of what we were just saying, right? Is that the world, okay, if you remember from last week, the world is that which is outside of Christ, okay? So verse 18, remember that the world is going to hate you. Verse 18, if the world hates you, you know that it has hated me before it hated you. If you were of the world would love its own. But because you are not of the world, but I chose you out of the world, because of this the world hates you. Remember the word that I said to you, a slave is not greater than his master. If they persecuted me, they will also persecute you. If they kept my word, they will keep yours also. But all these things they will do to you for my name's sake, because they do not know the one who sent me. All right? So, and then fast forward to chapter 16, verse 28. I came forth from the Father and have come into the world. I am leaving the world again and going to the Father. Verse 32, behold, an hour is coming and has already come for you to be scattered, each to his own home, and to leave me alone. And yet I am not alone, because the Father is with me. These things I have spoken to you, so that in me you may have peace. In the world you have tribulation, but take courage, I have overcome the world. You have peace in me. In the world you have tribulation, but take courage, I have overcome the world. Jesus literally says, I have become, or I am victorious over the world. Okay, and then he wraps it up in chapter 17 by talking about how we're separated from the world. Maybe Royce might touch a little bit on that next week, but the world, we shouldn't be surprised, right, if the world is just not in sync with us, and if they don't like what we believe and what we stand for. In fact, I think you could say that if the world doesn't disagree, and if the world doesn't have a problem with where we stand, then maybe we're not remaining in Jesus. Now the trick, right, is for us to not do it in an unloving manner, right? Because the goal is not to win arguments and prove others wrong and prove ourselves right. The goal is to glorify God, to bear fruit for Him, but to win souls. God doesn't want us to win arguments. He wants us to win souls. So we'll just wrap up with this idea of abide. And there's an acronym here that you can write down, and maybe go back to chapter 15 and look at this Last Supper, and you can study it and dig into it a little bit for yourself. But abide. What does it mean to abide? Ask. constantly going to God for what we need and understanding that he will provide, right? Now, there's a little bit difference here in chapter 15. He's talking to his disciples, but if we're asking for the right things, and that's why I love James so much, because, right, the thing we need most of all is wisdom. God's not going to give us a Ferrari just because we ask for it, right? But he is going to give us what we need, okay? So ask, believe, right? Never give up faith. Remaining in Jesus means to always trust and believe in him no matter what. Invest. It goes back to bearing fruit, right? Investing our time, our energy, our skills, our gifts for his glory, for his kingdom. Decide. It's a decision. It's a conscious effort that we make, right? Judas had the choice, and he decided not to abide and remain in Jesus. And then endure. Endure the persecution, the hate of the world, but remember that Christ has overcome the world. Remember that he loves us and that he always will, and that we belong to him. And if we remain in him, we've won also. So, appreciate your participation. Lord willing, Royce will wrap this series up next Sunday. Thank you.